Okay, thank you. With that, we're going to begin our discussion this afternoon or morning, depending upon where you're located, or if you're in Israel in the evening. We're very, very privileged to, as the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, to sponsor today's talk with David Horovitz. David is well known to many of us, as is evident by the overwhelming turnout for this particular call. He is the founding editor of the Times of Israel, which I'm sure many of us turn to several times during the day. And today's paper, it's okay to call it paper, I guess, David. Its headlines are about hearing in. What do you call it?
I said that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. So in today's edition, there we go. It says that the lead story at the swearing in of the new Knesset. Herzog says Israelis are, quote, exhausted from infighting. An article by the Times of Israel staff. So since its founding in 2011, if I'm correct, it's the fastest growing current affairs website in the Jewish world. Some 8 million users subscribe or use it monthly, and there are about 40 million monthly page views. I think I might be about 1 million of those, David, and I'm sure other colleagues as well. That's because the Times of Israel provides independent, nonpartisan coverage of Israel, which is very reliable and dependable, covering also the Jewish world. And in fact, many of us may not be aware of this, but it's also published in Hebrew, French, Arabic, and Persian. Many of us know David in some of his previous iterations. He had been previously editor of the Jerusalem Post for a number of years, and also the Jerusalem Report, where he had been the editor and publisher of the that award-winning journal. For his work, the B'nai B'rith gave him in 2014 the B'nai B'rith Lifetime Achievement Journalism Award. Again, David has conducted interviews with some of the top leaders across the spectrum in Israel and elsewhere, and is truly recognized as an expert on the Middle East. Any of us who have ever heard David recognize and know of his wonderful analysis. Today's program is brought to you by the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, which is a coalition of several hundred rabbis from all different movements across the country, North America, and we have people in Israel as well who are members. And the primary focus of the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition is to find a way in which rabbis can join together from all different movements, from all different persuasions, to constructively engage with Israel in building bridges between Israel and the Jewish people. Our focus is Klal Yisrael, unity, and how we are able to work together to be supportive and yet still be a constructive, effective voice in the internal debates that take place as well. The last thing I'll mention about the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition is that we will be holding a seminar in August of next year, Bezrat Hashem, to which we hope all of you will attend. We had a highly successful one this past May. We'll be sending more information about that. So please do feel free, if you haven't yet joined, to join the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition so that we're able to sponsor these kinds of programs. Without any further ado, the reason we're here is to understand what's happening. Today, the new Knesset was sworn in. The election was a little more than about 2 weeks ago or so. Earlier this week is when the president turned to Benjamin Netanyahu and charged him with forming the coalition. David, please, your analysis of both what happened and what's going to happen, and perspective on what's going on. And thank you so much for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Rabbi Weinblatt, and thank you for everybody who's joining this. So I'm speaking to you from my home in Jerusalem. It's 7 in the evening, and I'll try and give you an overview first of what's been unfolding in the last couple of weeks or so, and hopefully there'll be plenty of time for questions as well. The first thing is, indeed, the top of the site at the moment was the Knesset was sworn in a couple of hours ago. But I should start really today was also that ceremony took place in the shadow of a deadly terrorist attack near Ariel in the West Bank. These were killed by Palestinian who I think, as far as we know, worked in the Ariel industrial zone. And very, very terrible attack. A lot of investigation as to whether it could have been stopped a little earlier, because it went on for some time. He attacked in 3 separate places. And that indeed overshadowed the swearing in of the Knesset. And the other thing that I should stress from the get-go is, although the Knesset was sworn in, it's often the case that a new government takes office when the Knesset is sworn in. That's not what happened today. We don't have a new government yet. The outgoing government led by Prime Minister Yair Lapid is still running Israel. As Rabbi Weinblatt said on Sunday, after 64 of the 120 Knesset members recommended him, Benjamin Netanyahu was tasked by President Herzog with building a coalition. And I'll get into that obviously in some detail. And he had hoped to do it fairly quickly. He had already begun the contacts before he was formally tasked, but he hasn't signed any coalition agreements yet. And he's still negotiating with his only dependent on each other, I think, is complicating the process. I don't think there's any doubt that he will get this done, but he hasn't got it done yet. So going back 2 weeks, it's exactly 2 weeks since the elections. These were our fifth elections in less than 4 years, and the previous four had all been ultimately, I would say, non-definitive or indecisive. None of them produced stable, workable coalitions. And I think the electorate was feeling pretty battered. What's common, I think, to all these elections were an obvious majority and then a very divided country. The obvious majority, if you look at the outgoing Knesset, and now I have to call it the former Knesset, there was a strong right-wing majority in the last parliament. I think you could say that 70, 71, 72 of the outgoing Knesset members would consider themselves to be members of the Israeli right wing. And remember, left and right in Israel, we're generally speaking about attitudes to the Arab world, relations with the Palestinians, thoughts on peace and relinquishing territory. The more left wing, the more ready for territorial compromise, perhaps the more trust in the capacity to reach agreements. The more right wing, the more wary, the more unwilling. These are broad generalizations, but just to give you the big picture. So, there was a strong right-wing majority in the last Knesset, and yet the government, the coalition that ran Israel for the last 18 months was all over the place politically. I mean, literally all over the place, as diverse a coalition as Israel has ever had, from right-wing parties like Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu and Gidon Saar's New Hope, all the way across the center, Benny Gantz and Lapid's parties, into the left, Labour and Meretz, and even a conservative Islamic party, Ra'am, whose ruling charter, I should note, is pretty hostile to Israel, but whose political leadership basically threw in its lot with Israel's Jewish majority. So you had this curious situation where, although there was a right-wing majority, the government was not right-wing, and that's because there was a narrow, fleeting majority who were united by another goal, which was to keep Netanyahu out of power. And that's what the outgoing coalition was. It was a very, very narrow majority. It barely scraped into office, and it didn't hold on held on for barely a year. Its majority evaporated, and that prompted these elections. Now, these elections, for the first time in 4 years, did produce a decisive result. Now, it might not sound terribly decisive, but 64-56, in fact, speaking to Americans, I think you can well imagine that does sound decisive, right? So it's a big majority by Israeli standards, and it even seems big, I'm sure, now in the context of the midterms at your end. From very, very narrow 60-60 and 61-59 results, this time we had 64-56, and the 64 essentially went for, depends how you define them, but broadly speaking, 4, or you could say 5 or 6 parties. I'll explain what I mean by that. But in practice, when it came to the election day, it's 4 parties that garnered those 64 seats in the Knesset. The 4 parties being Netanyahu's Likud, the 2 ultra-Orthodox parties, that's Shas and United Torah Judaism, and an alliance, that's why I said you can consider it 4 or 6, an alliance of 3 parties that ran as a technical alliance under the heading Religious Zionism, which was the Religious Zionism Party led by Bezalel Smotrich, the Otzma Yehudit Party led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, and the Noam Party. Now, these are 3 parties that I would categorize as being on the far right of the Israeli political spectrum, and I'll elaborate on that in a few minutes. So there you had this alliance. This was the Netanyahu bloc, if you like, and they won 64 seats between them. So that's, by Israeli standards, a decisive majority. We should look into some of the factors behind it. clearly the big, I don't think a surprise, but the big hit of this election, if you compare this performance to previous performance, was religious Zionism. And they won 14 seats, which is a lot in a 120-member Knesset, almost half as many as Likud. They're now the third biggest party in parliament. They will break apart into their component factions in the next few days, I imagine. We just had the Knesset ceremony, as I said, and there's a traditional photograph that they have with the party chiefs. And Mr. Ben-Gvir, because he merged his party with Smotrich for the elections, when last I checked, he wasn't being allowed to pose in the photo with the party chiefs because he's not yet an independent party. And he said a couple hours ago, yeah, but I'll be breaking off in the next week or 10 days. So they ran together. They did extremely well. And Ben-Gvir was really the hit of these elections, I would say. Very charismatic, energetic politician with a profoundly problematic background, I would say. It's me speaking here, so you don't have to agree with me, but that's going to be it's going to be my sense that I'm trying to give you, and I'm trying to be as fair as I can. He stressed personal security. I think that was very resonant. A lot of the electorate was pretty traumatized, I think, by the deadly violence that flared inside Israel in May of last year in the so-called mixed cities in places like Ramla and Lod. And he was offering promises of greater personal security for Israelis. I think that was a factor. I think in the last elections, there was a sense of political betrayal by people, many of the people who had voted for the Yamina party of Naftali Bennett. I think they believed in the elections last year that if they were voting for Yamina, it was pretty sure, although there was a lot of wobbling by Bennett before the elections, but it was pretty clear they were voting for a pro-Netanyahu party. Remember, Israel never has single party government. It's always coalitions. And Yamina supporters would have expected that Bennett would be sitting in a Netanyahu-led government, instead of which Bennett joined with Lapid and those other parties that I mentioned in the anti-Netanyahu coalition and became prime minister. And I think one of the sources of the growth in support for the parties in that religious Zionism alliance was a backlash against Bennett and Yamina. I think many of the voters who went to this far-right alliance were voters who felt that they were let down by Bennett, and they wanted to be sure that if they were voting for a party where perhaps they felt a sort of religious sense of identification, that it would be siding with Netanyahu. It's also interesting, I think, to you all presumably know where you would kind of position yourselves on the various spectrums if you were in Israel. I think non-far right Orthodox Israelis, many of them, I don't know how many they are, but I think many of them felt at a bit of a loss that they didn't really have a party that spoke to them. Already getting into some of the minutiae, for example, Benny Gantz and his so-called National Unity Alliance, which brought in Gidon Saar for these elections, also brought in a man named Matan Kahana, who was the Minister of Religious Services in the outgoing coalition, Orthodox, former Israeli pilot and member of the elite Sayeret Matkal reconnaissance unit. So a stellar military career, very Orthodox, joined Benny Gantz's party. But to my mind, quite surprisingly, Gantz really didn't play him up as somebody who was a prominent figure in the party, didn't use him to reach out to Orthodox Israelis who might have been drawn to that party. And I think, like I say, many fairly moderate religious Israelis, and I don't know how many there are, didn't feel that they had a party to vote for. So those are some factors. I think probably among the most important factors in understanding this, fairly dramatic shift from very, very close pro and anti-Netanyahu balance to a pretty dramatic pro-Netanyahu win is the relative management skills of the two sides of the campaign. Again, these are my assessments. Netanyahu, I think, ran an extremely effective campaign in terms of technical management. I would say to some extent, to a troubling degree, and I'll elaborate on what I mean, but extremely effective in terms of his political interests. We have this incredibly pure electoral system. It's nationwide proportional representation. Almost everybody feels that their vote counts. And essentially, every vote does count and is reflected. If your party gets 10% of the votes nationwide, your party gets 10% of the seats in the Knesset. It's as simple as that, with one caveat. And the caveat is that there's a threshold. You have to clear this threshold to get any seats at all, and that's designed to discourage really minor parties from running. Doesn't have that effect, but that's why it's there. The threshold in these elections was 3.25%. You needed to get 3.25% of the national vote. Otherwise, all your votes went down the drain. Now, Netanyahu ensured that really, I would say, no significant number of potential supporting votes went down the drain. He even ensured that the various parties in his potential coalition signed what are called surplus votes agreements, so that if one of them, if they got into the Knesset and they were near to an extra seat, you could pool the extra votes between two parties to get your extra seat. As I said, he brokered this religious Zionism alliance. He had already mainstreamed, I would say, the far right Itamar Ben-Gvir, which I think was a dangerous thing for him to have done and something that he should not have done in a previous election. This time, he made sure that the religious Zionism alliance did not only extend to include Ben-Gvir, but even, and I don't know how to compare, still more radical, I don't know, virulently homophobic, very, very extreme, minor political party called Noam, which I think would probably have got a few tens of thousands of votes at the most. He brought them into this religious Zionism alliance as well to ensure that no votes got lost. Somebody might say, but what about Ayelet Shaked, who had sat in the outgoing government and revived a party called Jewish Home and insisted on running for elections? He didn't shut her down and he didn't bring her in. Well, I think it can be argued that she was perhaps drawing as many votes from the anti-Netanyahu bloc as from the pro-Netanyahu bloc, and therefore he wasn't too troubled by her run. She fell below the threshold. But none of the major parties in the Netanyahu bloc fell below the threshold, not at all. Likud did very well, Shas got 11 seats, United Torah Judaism did fine, and Religious Zionism got their 14 seats, and therefore Netanyahu wound up with 64. On the other side, the same cannot be said of Yair Lapid. He tried to encourage Meretz and Labour to merge. Meretz wanted to, Labour didn't. He was taken unawares when Balad, an anti-Zionist, Arab nationalist Arab party, ran alone, split away from two other Arab parties. And what's common to both Meretz and Balad is that both of them fell below the threshold. In the case of Meretz, there were 4,000 votes away from getting 4 seats, but 4,000 votes is, equivalent to no votes at all. They got no seats. All those votes went to waste. Balad scored 130,000 votes, quite near to the threshold. All those votes went to waste. And therefore, between those two parties alone, in the anti-Netanyahu bloc, I should distinguish between them. Balad would not have sat with a Lapid-led government. Meretz certainly would. But in the anti-Netanyahu side of the spectrum, almost 300,000 votes went to waste on those two parties alone. And you might say that that's 6 or 7 or 8 seats, depending on how you calculate it. And if things had been different, if Meretz had cleared the threshold, if Balad hadn't split away, maybe the result of the election would have been very different. And I've seen pollsters and experts claiming it might have been 60-60 or it might have been 62-58. In any case, it wouldn't have been 64-56. In my judgment, it is fair to say it would not have been 64-56. But beyond that, it's really a matter of some speculation. And among the caveats I would draw is you can't know how people would have voted if their options had been different. I think it's quite credible to believe that the Arab vote was actually increased because Balad ran separately, that they drew voters who wouldn't otherwise have voted. And therefore, I don't think there's any guarantee that if Balad had run with the rest of the joint list, they would have scored as many votes. I think it's pretty obvious that if Meretz and Labour had run together, they would have won more than the 4 seats that Labour won. Remember, Meretz got none. But would they have won 5, 6, 7? How can anybody know? And therefore, to say as a fact that the result would have been utterly different and to try to calculate it, I don't think you can do that. But I think you can fairly say that a more effective management of the potential votes in the anti-Netanyahu bloc would have produced an election that was closer. We have to stress that this process is entirely democratic. Netanyahu won 64-56 in complete observance of the democratic rules and norms of Israel. And I stress that because if you look at the popular vote, you can see that although the seats were 64-56, the pro and anti-Netanyahu pure raw votes were pretty much 50-50, depending again on who you designate in which camp, maybe a very slight advantage to the Netanyahu bloc. It underlines my point that better management of the anti-Netanyahu vote would have produced a closer election. But in the system that Israel operates, the 64-56 was a result of the democratic process and the relative skills and relative complacency, or otherwise, shall we say, on either side of that election battleground. So now we have a new Knesset sworn in, and we have Netanyahu trying to put together a coalition. It's worth saying that Netanyahu, as you know, the longest serving prime minister in Israel, in the past has wanted to not be at either extreme of his own coalitions. He's liked to have parties either side of him, generally parties a little more dovish than him. And if you look back over the years, he's had Ehud Barak in his coalition, and Lapid, of course, Tzipi Livni, and in 2020, Benny Gantz. That has been convenient for Netanyahu. He can, place himself in between and counterbalance demands from either side of him. And I think it might be assumed that Netanyahu would possibly want to do the same now. But I think there are two things to stress about that. First of all, I'm not sure that that's what he would want now, and I'll explain why in a minute, in terms of the possible policies and agendas of his coalition. And secondly, I don't think there's anybody he can attract. It may well be that there are some kind of behind the scenes overtures. Avigdor Lieberman has said that his party was approached and he won't sit with Netanyahu. Netanyahu might want to try and peel away some defectors from opposition parties, as he was able to do in bringing down the past coalition. Gantz has said that he won't join with him again, having been burned in the past. Lapid has said the same thing. So I don't see how Netanyahu could do it, even if he wants to. And then there's the point about even if he wants to. So you have this coalition, and I'll elaborate on some of the characteristics of some of the parties in it. But among the personal issues for Netanyahu, of course, is that he is on trial. He's deep into an ongoing trial for corruption. And the allies that he has in this nascent probable coalition, some of them at least, including from within his own Likud party, have made clear that they would seek to advance legislation that personally could be of great benefit to Netanyahu, whereas potential partners that he doesn't have anyway from elsewhere in the political spectrum would not incline to support those policies. So, for example, Bezalel Smotrich, the head of religious Zionism, a week before the elections, unveiled a major project of judicial quote-unquote reform, I would say revolution, and I'll elaborate on that as well in a minute. Among Smotrich's proposals were to abolish the criminal charge of breach of fraud and breach of trust. Now, that charge is the only charge that is common to all three of Netanyahu's corruption cases. Under criminal code in Israel, if you abolish an offense, it is applied not only from there on, but also to cases in which it is part of the indictment. So the charge that is common to all three of Netanyahu's cases potentially would be abolished if those proposals were introduced. Itamar Ben-Gvir has proposed definitively making that move retroactive to affect the Netanyahu trial. He's also proposed something called the French law, or a version thereof, under which serving prime ministers in Israel would not be put on trial for alleged offenses carried out while they're in office. The French reference is interesting because in France, a president cannot be put on trial for offenses conducted in office. The difference, of course, is that in France, there are no term limits, and therefore, after 2 terms, a president would have to face any music, whereas in Israel, of course, there are no term limits. Anyway, my point is that some of the declared agenda items for his coalition partners would be directly beneficial to Netanyahu, and therefore he may want specifically this very coalition in terms of its impact on his very controversial criminal trial, I would add, by the way. If fraud and breach of trust is eliminated, then he's only facing a single count of bribery in one case. These are very complicated indictments, and it takes wiser legal minds than mine, and I don't think them either, to give you a definitive assessment as to whether Netanyahu would be convicted on any or all of these charges in any case. I want to elaborate a little bit on some of the unique characteristics of this coalition that we believe will come to pass. First of all, it's going to be, I would say, the most hawkish government in the history of Israel. It's a Likud that has become more hawkish over the years. It's the 2 ultra-Orthodox parties who I think are, would broadly say that they are empathetic to Zionism, but in many cases are not motivated deeply by Zionism, certainly not as much as they are motivated by their sense of Israel as a Jewish state. And in the religious Zionism alignment, it is the most far-right political grouping that is ever going to have sat and played a substantive role in the Israeli government until fairly recently. For example, Netanyahu himself considered Itamar Ben-Gvir's political agenda to be so extreme that he declared him to be not fit to serve as a minister in a coalition that he would assemble. Running up to these elections, he changed his stance and said that yes, Itamar Ben-Gvir could be a minister. And Mr. Ben-Gvir is heading, I don't know, we'll know it when it happens, but he's set his heart on becoming the Minister of Public Security. That's the minister in charge of the police. And that's pretty surreal, I think would be one way of putting it. This is somebody who has multiple convictions, including for incitement to terrorism. This is someone who first came to prominence as a young man when he gave an interview on television shortly before the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, where he posed with the symbol that had been stolen from Prime Minister Rabin's Cadillac and said, "We got to Rabin's car, we can get to him too." This is someone who until recently had a photograph in his living room of Baruch Goldstein, who you'll recall massacred 29 Palestinians at prayer in the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron. Ben-Gvir claims to have moderated. He no longer calls to expel all Arabs from Israel, only now to expel those he deems disloyal Arabs. He claims to have moderated since Israel's police chief in May of 2021 accused him of helping to fan the flames of some of that internal tension that I spoke about before. But just a few weeks ago, Mr. Ben-Gvir was brandishing his personal gun on a visit to the disputed, shall we say, Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem. He was being protected by border police officers, and he was encouraging them to open fire on Arabs who were throwing stones in the area in their direction. The border police officers did not feel that their lives were in danger and therefore did not open fire. Ben-Gvir says he'd like to ease the open fire regulations if he has the authority to do so. He's also a big advocate of Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount. I don't know how much of the history I should go into of this, but of course, Israel captured the Temple Mount in 1967, and Moshe Dayan told the Muslim Trust, the Jordanian appointed officials who were responsible for the Muslim holy places atop the Temple Mount, that Israel was now the sovereign power, but that he would allow them to continue to administer the Muslim holy places. Jews would be allowed to visit, but not to pray, and Jews would pray at the Western Wall. Of course, he was using the halachic tradition that observant Jews should not set foot on the Temple Mount for fear of setting foot in the area of the Holy of Holies. And he was using that because he wanted to avoid a sort of full confrontation with the Muslim world. In calling Netanyahu just the other day to congratulate him on his election victory, Jordan's King Abdullah, we don't have a readout of what was said, but it can be fairly reliably assumed that he and others have been saying to Netanyahu, please do not let Mr. Ben-Gvir change the status quo on the Temple Mount. If Jewish prayer is to be allowed, this will cause tremendous tension. There have been people who've suggested that this will cause war. But Mr. Ben-Gvir thinks that Jewish prayer should be permitted on the Temple Mount. He would not have the authority to enable this, I do not believe, as the minister in charge of the police, but he is an advocate of it. Mr. Smotrich, who is angling to be the defense minister, is somebody who is very hostile to Arabs, very hostile to the gay community. He is very hostile to non-Orthodox streams of Judaism, most emphatically the Reform movement. Common to both of these people is their relative absence, and in Ben-Gvir's case, absolute absence of any military service. Ben-Gvir was not allowed to be drafted. The IDF chose not to draft him because of his extremist background. Smotrich did reduced army service. It's not entirely clear under what circumstances. He was a yeshiva student. He then studied law, and therefore I think he postponed army service. And then when he did do army service, it was further shortened. It may be because he was already a Knesset candidate. The notion of him as defense minister has prompted a great deal of concern from some in the Israeli security establishment and less concern from others. Interestingly, he allegedly was involved, he was very close to being prosecuted for his alleged involvement in a plot to try to protest the 2005 Israeli disengagement from Gaza by causing havoc on the Ayalon highway, including allegedly being found to have gathered oil to be used on this major highway. He was not prosecuted, reportedly because the Shin Bet didn't want to burn the sources who would have had to testify. But he has been publicly alleged to have been involved in that in the last few days, again, by people from within the Shin Bet. So you have very, very controversial figures. You'll also know that Ben-Gvir has already called for Israel to revoke its approval of reform conversions to Judaism in Israel. So these are very, very controversial figures. Again, Ben-Gvir, who claims to have moderated, nonetheless, last week went and spoke at a ceremony commemorating Rabbi Meir Kahane, who was banned from the Knesset after one term and whose Kach party was banned as racist, and the current iteration of which is still regarded as a designated terrorist organization in the United States. He spoke at this event and he said he no longer seeks to expel all Arabs. He was booed for the quote unquote relative moderation of that stance. And he was condemned, and the event was condemned by the US State Department, as you probably noticed, which said it was abhorrent that there would be a commemoration for an organization that is still designated as a terrorist entity, which gives you a sense, I think, of some of the concerns and the potential concerns and repercussions, depending on which people from which of the composite parties in the coalition are appointed to which positions. You may have seen some Jewish leaders, including the head of the Conference of Presidents yesterday, publicly expressing concern about a call from the United Torah Judaism Party to perhaps amend the law of return to abolish the so-called grandchild clause that gives you automatic rights to citizenship if you have one Jewish grandparent. So you have a coalition coming to coalesce here, likely to come to coalesce here, whose members have some pretty radical agendas and feel that they may be capable of getting at least elements of those implemented. And there's one more thing that I want to come back to, which is the notion of judicial reform. I feel very strongly about this. And again, there will be people who will give you a different assessment of it, and that's legitimate. These are my assessments and my best efforts at fair judgments. You should read widely. You should look for other sources of information for sure. But the judicial reform that is apparently being prepared, I think essentially threatens to radically shatter the checks and balances of the Israeli democratic system. I think it's worth noting that in his address to the Knesset today, President Herzog did not rule out, quite sensibly, the imperative to consider whether those checks and balances are operating properly, and there may be room for reform. He said it may even be desired, but it was vital, he said, to do it while listening carefully and to do it fairly. I stress, we don't know exactly what kind of quote unquote override clause this coalition will seek to advance or will advance. But the override clause that we are told they have in mind is one that would basically make it irrelevant were the Supreme Court, the High Court of Justice in Israel, to strike down Israeli legislation. I just got to give you a little bit of context on this. We don't have a constitution in Israel. We have semi-constitutional, quasi-constitutional basic laws. We don't have a Bill of Rights. We don't have the three elements of governance in the fullest meaning, by which I mean, of course, we have an executive. We have a coalition that will take office. It will hold a majority in parliament. By definition, since we only have one House of Parliament, the coalition has a majority. Parliament is generally not terribly capable of stopping legislation that the coalition wants to back, especially with a coalition like this, which is remarkably relatively homogeneous. If you're going to have 64 Knesset members who agree on anything, the Knesset will be incapable of stopping them, because at the most it could muster 56 opponents, and those 56 are not united on pretty much anything. So essentially in Israel, we are left with not an executive, a legislature, and a judiciary, but just an executive and a judiciary. And the override clause that is being planned would give a simple absolute majority, in other words, 61 votes. That's all that would be necessary to re-legislate or reimpose legislation or government decisions that the Supreme Court has struck down or said cannot be proceeded with because they are undemocratic, or to put it in terms of the Israeli context, at odds with Israel's basic laws. If this proposal is implemented in that way, it means all power is with the coalition, all power is with the political majority of the day, in my understanding, without any viable checks and balances. And therefore, I don't consider this to be quote unquote reform so much as a neutering of the only other check on the political majority of the day. And therefore, I consider it to be extremely significant, a real threat to Israel's democratic processes and so on. Again, other people have other takes on this. Okay, I've been speaking for a long time. I'm sure there are other things that that you'll want me to touch on, or that I haven't raised. I will end with one more point. In his victory speech on late on November the 1st, Netanyahu did not use the word democracy. He spoke about rights, but he spoke about the election as a resounding affirmation of Israel as a Jewish state and the Jewish identity of the country. In his address on Sunday, when he was charged with the task of mustering a coalition, he did use the word democracy twice. I think that was very significant. He spoke about the elections as the confirmation of the democratic process, and he spoke of the democratic sovereign state of Israel. I think that's really important. Netanyahu, in his speech on Sunday, was extremely conciliatory. He spoke about the imperative to ensure the preservation of individual rights. Again, I think that's really important in the context of what I said before, because there will be no practical guarantee of minority rights if the Supreme Court is neutered. So I think Netanyahu was striking a conciliatory tone after an election in which he was very divisive and routinely castigated all his opponents as leftists who were a danger to the state of Israel. He's trying to set a different tone now. He is going to be among the most moderate figures in this coalition if it comes to fruition in the shape that we anticipate. The issue is whether Netanyahu, on the dovish edge of a coalition, some of whose agenda is in his personal interest, will want to or will be able to constrain some of the desires of his coalition partners. And maybe the very last thing that I will say is that at his victory night event on November the 1st, Itamar Ben-Gvir was hailed by his supporters as the next prime minister of Israel. There's a little song that is often used on such occasions. Here he comes, the next prime minister of Israel. Ben-Gvir said, no, I'm not the prime minister yet. I think that is Ben-Gvir's ambition. I'm not sure how hard he will push his agenda in this coalition, but I certainly I believe he sees this coalition as his stepping stone to a far higher power. Okay, and with that, I'll stop, and then you guys take this wherever you like.
Thank you, David. Wow, what a tour de force and explanation of the complexities of this election. We've received a few questions. Anyone who would like to ask one, please put one in Q&A, and I'll try and do what I can. Let me start off by, since you were just talking about the role of Prime Minister-elect Netanyahu often being a moderating force. As I was listening to your description about the way in which he played the election, my sense is that old saying comes to mind that Bibi was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. It seemed as if he had a sense of what to do. But how much of this election, two questions about that, how much of this election was about Bibi? Because so many of the previous elections, in many respects, were pro or anti-Bibi. Was that a factor here? And then secondly, I'll just wrap this in there as well. One of the things that I took away from his speeches since the election is that he's very interested in expanding the Abraham Accords. You mentioned about the conversation with the King of Jordan, counseling Bibi to be wary of that. I heard this also from sources from the UAE that they're a little bit concerned. So is that going to be, I think that's really what seems to me to be his last desire for a lasting legacy, would be to expand the Abraham Accord. So how's he going to moderate that? So again, my question about how much of it was about Bibi, and then, in terms of how this is going to play out. And then we'll go on to some other questions as well.
Okay, so these are good questions, of course, and important questions. The first thing is, I think for all these elections, there were two, I don't know if you would call not wanting Netanyahu as prime minister an ideological mission, but there were two, core issues, I suppose, lots of others as well. There was the right-left thing, and especially relating to matters concerned with security. Israelis very often vote, or very high in their agenda is their sense of who's going to keep them safe and who's going to keep their kids safe in the army. And then there was the Netanyahu issue. And I think what happened is that the previous coalition distorted the right-wing majority, as I said, because they were able to muster a narrow anti-Netanyahu majority. I don't think that the pro and anti-Netanyahu forces changed terribly much, but I think the right wing reasserted itself and broke away from Bennett, who they felt abandoned them in large numbers, and they went for a party that indeed stuck with Netanyahu and will stick with Netanyahu. So it was the one kind of asserting itself over the other to some extent, with heightened concern about personal security, and with a very, very effective candidate. I'm not talking about Netanyahu. I'm talking very much about Ben-Gvir, who is a very, very potent candidate. Netanyahu too, of course, an extraordinary campaigner, as you rightly say, indefatigable, relentless, using every political trick in the book, and also in terms of energy. Older than his rivals from from Gantz and Lapid and on the other side, and yet out energizing them on the campaign trail for sure. The second part of your question is, it's worth stressing, again, in his speech on Sunday, Netanyahu said a lot about peace in the region. It was a brief speech, but it was very interesting. We reported the key parts of it, so you can go back and look at it if you want to. He spoke about the desire to widen the circle of peace with Israel among those peoples in the region who want peace, and then he took pains to say, and I believe that's most of them. He also said, I believe that will solve the Arab-Israeli conflict. I deliberately didn't say the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but I do believe that this is the path to solving that conflict as well, eventually. So it was a very, like I say, a very, very conciliatory speech in terms of domestic unity, a vow to heal rifts, and also in terms of the message he was sending to the region. And I just want to add the caveat, and I'm sorry to do that. Two things. That's what victorious politicians smartly do the day after. They call for unity and they promise to rule for everybody. The coalition, the only coalition that I can see him putting together, will be very, very firmly supported by approximately 50% of the Israeli public, and very, very dramatically antithetical, shall we say, to how almost half of the country see core interests, and in some cases, incredibly vital personal interests and needs. And therefore, this most divisive of politicians will have a task as never before if he wants to truly honor that pledge to try to heal internal rifts and govern in a way that most Israelis can reasonably feel comfortable with. It's going to be very difficult.
Based on that, David, any possibility of Gantz or Lapid or any of the other potential coalition partners in the opposition being brought in, is there any possibility of that you see, or not?
Look, I don't think you should rule it out until it hasn't happened, right? Because if you've asked me a day before Benny Gantz, after 4 elections, if I get my arithmetic correct, where the sole goal of his and his allies was to keep Netanyahu from power, and then one day in 2020 he changed tack and he joined the Netanyahu coalition. You would not have believed that was going to happen until it happened. And therefore, don't say never until never is off the agenda, or until it's off the agenda for now, right? What Gantz and Lapid have specifically said, and so to Lieberman, and I'm sure Gideon Saar, is no, we will not sit with Netanyahu. They've been saying it every day, whenever anybody asks them. And it should also be noted, I haven't heard Netanyahu calling out and saying, I actually want to build a more diverse coalition. I want to add to my bloc people from elsewhere on the spectrum. I think that's healthy in the national interest and so on. So we're hearing a preemptive refusal from potential allies and no public concerted effort from the person who's tasked with building a coalition. And therefore, it seems extremely unlikely. When he swears in his coalition, we'll know for sure.
So getting back to the Ben Gvir, which actually has been a big focus of the conversation here, one of the questions that came in among the issues that the religious Zionists have wanted to put on the table are reconsideration of the law of return, the aspect of conversions in the diaspora by the reform movement and probably conservative as well, perhaps changing the law of return vis-a-vis the grandparents. How big of a danger should we think that this is going to be to the relations with the Jews in the diaspora? Or do you think, again, that Netanyahu will be able to moderate that? We saw that there was somebody from the Noam party who said they wanted to cancel the gay rights parade in Jerusalem, and the very next day, Netanyahu said that's not happening. So tell us a little bit what you anticipate about these dynamics, how concerned we should be about some of these things.
Look, they're still playing out, and I don't want to be definitive in areas where we can't be yet. So there are some interesting things to bear in mind. This will be, as I say, an atypical and unprecedentedly hawkish and a coalition that's coming together. And it's not only the Religious Zionism Alliance, it's also the ultra-Orthodox parties feeling particularly empowered, having felt particularly excluded from power for the past year and a half. So we will see, for example, why does United Torah Judaism and Shas, why do they want a court override clause? Because the Supreme Court has prevented the parliaments and governments of the day from legislating that ultra-Orthodox males don't have to serve in the army. Because it regards that legislation as discriminatory against the rest of the Israeli public that does. The Supreme Court would not allow disproportionate funding for ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students. I don't know what the Supreme Court would say about national funding, state funding for ultra-Orthodox private schools that don't teach core curriculum. So they have issues that they know the judges would oppose, and therefore they support legislation to neuter the judges. By the same token, the law of return trial balloon, maybe, was floated first not by Religious Zionism, as far as I understand, but by United Torah Judaism. The reform conversions thing is indeed coming from the Religious Zionism party. This points to potent members of a likely coalition who feel that they will be able to do more that suits their agenda than they were able to do in the past. I don't know what will be with the law of return. I tend to think that Netanyahu would want to stand against that if it was aggressively advanced by his partners in the coalition. And I think, if I had to guess, I don't know that I would expect that to gain traction. But I do think the notion of who's a Jew and the status of non-Orthodox Judaism will be closer to front burner than it has been for certainly the last year and a half, if not more than that, because parties who have an interest in that will have more power and more leverage than has been the case. And so much depends on Netanyahu. So you mentioned the Noam statements about, this is an anti-gay party with a declared agenda. And indeed, Netanyahu slapped them down pretty fast. But also, you should note that about an hour after the leader of that party complained that he hadn't been invited to negotiate with Netanyahu as the head of a party, Netanyahu invited him to negotiate. You will notice that in the run-up to the campaign, to the election, Netanyahu said that foreign affairs, defense, and finance, those three key ministries, he would be aiming to keep in the hands of his own Likud party. And yet, he's certainly negotiating both with Shas, Aryeh Deri, and with Religious Zionism, Smotrich, potentially for two of those three posts to go to coalition allies rather than Likud. You might ask why. You might ask why Netanyahu simply doesn't say to them, you know, guys, there's no coalition without me. We're the biggest party. We're twice as big as you. In fact, we're much more because you're only a technical alliance. And I said before that I'm not giving defense to anybody outside Likud, and I'm not giving finance to anybody outside Likud. Now, that might turn out to be what happens. If that doesn't happen, if Bezalel Smotrich is made defense minister, for example, or Aryeh Deri is made the finance minister, which is possible, but we don't know for sure just yet, what does that suggest in terms of Netanyahu's readiness to stand up to demands of coalition partners with which he is uncomfortable? So, you know, watch all those processes and you'll draw conclusions, and then things will play out. If Smotrich is not made defense minister, and if Deri is not made finance minister, and those posts go to Likud members, that would suggest Netanyahu is feeling fairly robust about fending off demands with which he's not comfortable. So I would certainly keep watch of that.
What about the role of President Herzog? He certainly has been a tremendously unifying force, and he's called for that and so on. Does he have much to offer in the context of this coalition building and or governing or anything like that?
Look, the truth is, no matter who the president is, the answer to your question is no. When you have a 64-56 coalition, even if you had an incredibly outspoken president, which Herzog is not, and an incredibly undiplomatic president, which Herzog is not, and a president who was deeply antithetical to or opposed to Netanyahu, which Herzog is not, it wouldn't really matter because the majority is so clear. So Herzog, before the elections, was talking about it being in Israel's interest to have a unity coalition. He was thinking, I'm sure, of people like Benny Gantz. The fact is that Benny Gantz won 12 seats for his party in the elections. Religious Zionism won 14. It is not inconceivable, and that's why, you know, I've littered everything I've said with caveats, that there's some kind of terrible breakdown in negotiations between Netanyahu and either Ben-Gvir or Smotrich, probably not both of them. But if there's a breakdown with one of them, and he doesn't have a majority because he's holding tough on positions that someone like Gantz would feel are very important. I mean, let's play a hypothetical here. He doesn't want to give Smotrich the defense minister. He doesn't want the defense ministry. Aryeh Deri wants to be finance minister. So there's no other top level position that Smotrich is happy with. And Netanyahu says, you know what? We'll just have to hold off for the time being. And behind the scenes, he contacts Gantz and he says, look, I'm trying to build a more diverse coalition. I think it's in Israel's interests. You're the defense minister. You're a former chief of staff of the army. It's you or Smotrich. Come join me. I'll keep Smotrich out of the coalition. We'll have a more diverse coalition. I'll be better able to represent Israelis. Me personally, you know, I would find a Gantz who said, you know what, if it's credible, if I'm genuinely going to have a substantial voice at the coalition table, if it's going to mean that we can more easily head off agenda issues that are very troubling for me, you know, one would have some respect for a Gantz who at least weighed that possibility. So, you know, again, keep that possibility in mind. And Herzog would I'm sure want to encourage that. Herzog today, a very, you know, a sort of anguished speech. You know, you quoted at the beginning, the Israeli public is sick of the infighting, and I added some more sense of some of the things that he said today. He wants to foster unity. He is anguished by the divides in the Israeli public. He called, I think it was him, if it wasn't him, it was the Speaker of the Knesset, talking about the internal rifts in Israel being the most dangerous challenge that Israel faces. These are genuinely felt concerns by statesmen-like and would-be statesmen-like Israeli leaders, most of all Herzog. And therefore, if he was able to encourage that, he'd be very happy to. But the fact is that the 64-56 means that the ball is very much in Netanyahu's hand, and it's a factor of how he chooses to act, how unyielding people like Smotrich are. And that, you know, again, I'm sorry to be full of complicating factors, but let's remember, a year and a half ago, Netanyahu could have built a majority coalition if he had partnered with Ra'am. Ra'am would not have been inside his coalition, but he could have leaned on Ra'am for support from outside the coalition. And it is fairly credibly believed that he was willing to do that and that he negotiated with the leader of Ra'am. And Smotrich said no. We would rather go into opposition than be part of a coalition that leans even from the outside on the support of an Arab party. You know, Smotrich is ideologically uncompromising to a large extent, I believe. Whether he's uncompromising in terms of which position he gets in government, you know, there I don't know. There I suspect he is more willing to compromise. But, you know, there is a scenario where it all falls apart in the talks and Bibi reaches out to Benny Gantz. At this moment, it is a very marginal possibility. Let's wait and see.
Let me ask you one last question because we're almost out of time, and that is, in terms of the role of diaspora Jewry, as all this is playing out. As you know, there's some American Jewish organizations which have come out critical of both Ben-Gvir and the potential of his being part of the government and so on. And there are others which have held their fire and have not yet commented on the specifics of that, some who have been supportive, et cetera. The Zionist Rabbinic Coalition in general seeks to be supportive of the government of Israel, the democratically elected government, but to communicate privately concerns that we may have through various channels. Your thoughts about you know, the approach of American Jewish community at this time?
Well, look, I appreciate that you asked me that, and it's and we have different roles, right? You and me, and you and all the people who are on this call. You know, I'm a journalist, and my job is to make information available and try and analyze it and convey it, and empower people through that information to make the choices that they feel are right. I feel personally very strongly that someone like Itamar Ben-Gvir has no place in the government of Israel. I feel very strongly that an override clause of the nature that's being discussed is a terrible threat, a real acute threat to Israeli democracy. And I have other concerns, all of which I hope I've expressed in this call, and I've written about them. And I appreciate that you chose to reach out to me, having read what I've written. I run a website that's called The Times of Israel. It's a Zionist entity. It's a Zionist website, and I personally support an Israel that has maintained the miracle of being a Jewish and a democratic state. I think it's an incredible thing. I think whoever put together the wording of that Declaration of Independence in the middle of a war designed to wipe us out before we had drawn breath, put together a document that should represent Israel and its foundational principles, and we shouldn't abandon those principles. When I see those principles in threat, you know, being threatened, I write about it and I speak about it. If you consider some of those concerns to be valid, you have to debate among yourselves how best to express that concern. You know, it is for the people of Israel to determine the direction this country takes, and they voted. They voted within the constraints of the system that I set out, but the public spoke, the electorate spoke. And it's ultimately the electorate in Israel that bears the consequences. However, it is also the Jewish state. It has a responsibility to the Jewish nation around the world, the Jewish people around the world. It feels that responsibility keenly. It is invested in the relationship. The relationship is crucial to the well-being of both sides. And you have to decide how to make your concerns impactful. You know, if you feel acute concerns, then your goal is to make sure that concern is brought to bear most effectively, which in some cases can be very public outcry, and in some cases can be, you know what, much more effective to work behind the scenes. You have to make those decisions, and I don't envy you them. But I hope that I've given you at least material to help you gauge how you should draw conclusions and how to act upon them.
David, I want to thank you. First of all, I want to thank all of our participants for joining today. One of my takeaways from your talk today, of which there are many, is the truth of the old adage, it's not over till it's over. That this is, we're in the middle of not a picture, but a still picture, but rather of a moving picture. And what you say today, 2 weeks from now may be entirely different, I'm sure, which points out the two conclusions I want to make, and that is the importance of going to the Times of Israel. It is truly, before the call began, David and I were talking about it being a 24/7 news cycle, and it's very true, and it's constantly updated. It's a wonderful source of information. I know how terribly busy you are, and the fact that you took the time to spend with us, the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, is greatly appreciated, David. And let me also just say that I think in many respects, the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition is more important than ever for precisely the reasons that David was speaking, in terms of our building a bridge between both the American Jewish community and with Israel. And we invite those of you who are friends and supporters of the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition to please help to continue to support us. Those of you who are members to renew your membership, and if you're not already a member, to please do so. So again, thank you so much, David. Really tremendously insightful. I took a whole page of notes right here, and as I'm sure many of my colleagues did as well. Toda rabah.
Thank you, everybody.